Good afternoon and welcome to today's special event, Understanding Vaccine Hesitancy, Applying Artificial Intelligence-Guided Social Media Analysis. My name is Dr. Jennifer Perkins, and from all of us here at Walden University, we thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. Please note that this webinar will be archived, so you will have an opportunity to view the presentation again or even share this with a friend or colleague. If you need accommodations to attend this webinar, please contact disability@mail.waldenu.edu. Before we get into today's content, we want to take a moment to go over a few items to make sure you get the most out of this program. On the screen in front of you, you will see the main presentation and a second section for submitting questions to our presenter. All these windows, as well as other items of interest, can be opened and closed at your convenience using the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can size these windows as you see fit, so feel free to set them to your comfort level as we move on. To submit questions to our presenters, please use the Q&A window. Questions submitted by viewers watching on demand will still be received by someone on our team. To access the closed captions for this event, please open the media player window from the toolbar on the bottom of your screen, clicking the CC or closed caption buttons in the lower right-hand corner of that window will toggle the captions for this event. Please note you will need to keep that window open throughout the event to see the captions. With those items out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Also,
thank you, Jennifer.
Keep in mind that this webinar is approved for one continuing contact hour through the National Commission for Health Education Credentialing, the National Board of Public Health Examiners, and the American Nurses Credentialing Center on Accreditation. With that, I'm going to turn the time over now to our first presenter, Dr. Bruce Reagan.
Thank you. Sorry for jumping in on your spiel there. My apologies. Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to spend some time with us this afternoon. I'm going to run real quick here through the basics of what we'd like to address here this afternoon. First and foremost, let's take a look. There we go. We want to explain misinformation and the flow of information to better understand this concept of vaccine hesitancy. And what makes this so critical is that we don't seem to be getting better. I'm hoping that we're not getting worse, but we don't seem to be getting better with that. Number two, we want to understand the psychology behind the social connection in social media. Three, we want to differentiate between the different types of machine learning categories. And I think you're going to find this aspect of our presentation today to be truly outstanding. And that's my colleague is going to take that over here shortly. And then the last is we want to explore the research tools in Python that's available for AI research. Okie doke. All right. So I think Jennifer already covered that, I believe. Okie doke. And so our abstract here today for this is, as you all know, the pandemic vaccine hesitancy has created so many advanced problems in dealing with the pandemic itself. As a matter of fact, as we're going to talk as we go through this, is that we've actually created, the problem has become an infodemic. And because we have not been able to move people through the vaccine stages of things, then now all of a sudden we have more virulent strains. Now, as we get through this, we're going to talk about the social movement and Twitter and so forth and its impact. But what we want to do today is we want to take and we want to talk about how this disinformation and misinformation has been woven throughout and how it has impacted and influenced people in this decision process in regard to vaccination. What's really exciting, though, is using this concept of artificial intelligence to help us in social media research to figure out what are the influencing factors, and how can we best design programs to address those? Okie doke. All righty. Okay, so I wanted to share this with you right off the get-go, and I kind of labeled it "Gotta Love This," because that's exactly what I thought when I read this. So in preparation for this presentation, I mean, just a plethora of information that was available. So I came across this NBC News story, okay? And here was the title: Top Social Media Platforms Unsafe for LGBTQ Users Report Finds. That was the main heading. And then the secondary heading underneath that was Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube are, quote, effectively unsafe for LGBTQ users, end of quote, according to GLAAD inaugural Social Media Safety Index. Thought, wow. So I read through the story. Then at the end of it, was NBC's advertisement, which said, follow NBC out on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And I'm sorry, I had to have one of those V8 moments where I slap myself up on the forehead, think, here's a story about how this stuff is all screwed up, but doggone it, you're still going to advertise. Whoop, sorry about that. And so it just kind of blew me away that then became part of their advertisement. So, and as we start to take a look at this misinformation and so forth as we go through here, it's that kind of wacky stuff that's going to pop up time and time again. All right. Here's our first quiz. You ready? Yeah, you thought you were going to sit back and love life here, but no. You got to go to work. According to NPR, what percentage of COVID misinformation and lies on social media platforms comes from the disinformation dozen? And for those of you who may not be, there's like 12 people that have hit social media extremely hard. So what percentage of COVID misinformation do you think comes just from that disinformation dozen? And then we get to about 60% of the participants will just bring it out. Okay. All right. So according to NPR, what percentage of COVID misinformation lies on social media platforms comes from the disinformation dozen? Actually, it's 65%. Right? So we had some folks that actually gave them more at 85. So 65% of the misinformation and outright lies comes from this 12 wonderful people. But see, here's the key, though, is many people are willing to accept information on social media equally with expert medical recommendations and medical information from the CDC. And that's the scary part. How can we take stuff that comes out of social media where anybody and their mother can post anything they want, and we're going to take that as equally valuable as stuff coming from the CDC? And I used to look at that and say, this is nuts. This can't be true. This can't be right. But as we're going to hopefully demonstrate today, it makes more sense than what it should. So here's the battle. Inaccurate information is spreading faster than the virus itself. And when I start to hear the World Health Organization state these claims, it really gets my attention. And especially this concept that deep-seated conspiracy beliefs are seemingly impervious to intrusions of evidence and reality. Well, most of us are learned educators. And so evidence and reality is what we really try to strive for and use in our own decision-making and educating our students. But how in the world do these conspiracy beliefs seem to be impervious? How does that happen? As a matter of fact, it's gotten so bad that WHO has declared a vaccine hesitancy as the top 10 threat in 2019. And that hesitancy, to a great extent, is from these deep-seated conspiracy beliefs. And that's crazy. That is just truly crazy. All right, back to work again. You ready? Okay, which of the following are not true? A sufficiently repeated lie becomes a truth. That's from the Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels. B, post-truth. Objective facts are less influential than appeals to emotion. C, fake news. Misinformation that creates an unsettling loss of confidence. D, infodemic. Overabundance of information with trustworthy sources being questioned. Or E, none of the above. What do you think? Which of the following are not true? Got you thinking a little bit. Okay, let's take a look-see. Okay, we have 50, half of us thought none of the above. 5.7 for A, 20% B, 11% C, and 11% D. They're all true. But the Nazi one gave me some real chills, I'll tell you what. Yeah. So let's go back here for a second. And this is in quotes. This actually was said by this guy. A sufficiently repeated lie becomes a truth. Post-truth. It's actually, believe it or not, the concept of post-truth has a definition now in the Oxford Press. As a set of circumstances in which objective facts are less influential than appeals to emotion and personal beliefs. That's crazy. Fake news is, in fact, misinformation that creates an unsettling loss of confidence. And we're going to talk about that here a little bit too. Infodemic, we've all heard that one. So, with all these being true, why in the world are people rejecting medical science? Well, here are 4 pieces to this really elaborate puzzle. And the first is the illusory truth phenomenon. And that is that disinformation and lies become true if heard often enough. And as we've just heard from the Nazi Goebbels, that if you tell something that's a lie frequently enough, then people are going to believe it. And as we're going to see as we move down here, is that the anti-vaccine people retweet and tweet far more than pro-vaccine people. And I mean, the difference is phenomenal. So irrespective of what their message is, the fact that it's being put out there so frequently for a lot of people is enough. If they hear it enough, then they believe it. The second item is availability heuristic. An idea is easy to recall, is more believable. And I think that's one of the areas that we as professionals have really kind of, we've been very weak here because we haven't been good enough to take these sometimes very elaborate concepts and put them into a message that is easily understood. The third is the facility of anecdotal vividness. And that is emotional claims catch our attention. one of the pieces that you're going to see here as we move forward is that so many of the anti-vaxxers use these personal, emotional filled pieces, and they reach out and grab people and literally reach out and touch their hearts. And so people are more drawn to these personal than they are to the scientific. And the last is a distinct anti-authoritarian drive. And this is a concept that people have a contempt for expertise. They see themselves as free thinkers, and they're not going to follow authority. Now, I have to tell you right up front that I am as a bigger contributor to the rejection of medical science as anyone. And I'll tell you why. I'm not on Facebook. And for a lot of you who are teaching online, at least for me, I looked at this and said, you know what? I spent enough time online. I don't need to spend any more time. And so I'm not even on Facebook. I have nothing to do with Facebook. And it's because of people like me that are just saying, you know what, I'm out. I'm not. Instagram, TikTok, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. WhatsApp, no. And so I have contributed by not being a part of this. And the second piece of this I have contributed to is look at this terminology. A fallacy of anecdotal vividness? Are you kidding me? And to have something that means emotional claims catch our attention, why don't we just say emotional claims catch our attention? But because of the nature of our business, oftentimes science is hard to break down to its bare elements. And oftentimes we just don't have the ability to do that. So somebody on the outside looks at that and says, oh, you mean this. And they put it in these very succinct emotional terms. And people look down and go, oh, yeah, okay, I know that. And so this is part of, I think, our problem. Okay. So how do we counter these bogus narratives? All right. Well, a lot easier said than done. But here's a couple ideas that have seen their way clear. One of which is simply increasing understanding. We have this idea that people who believe these bogus narratives are typically, for the most part, uneducated. As a matter of fact, roughly 20% of Americans believe that COVID was planned. But when we take a look at those with a high school education or less, that number went up to 48%. And we see statistics like that and we say, oh, okay, well, it's those that have high health, have low health literacy levels. But we also know that's not the case because we have a group of reasonably educated people who are also buying into these bogus narratives. So this has some merit, but it's not the total answer. The second, instilling a sense of control. There's this reaction to a diminished lack of control that's basically unrelated to the topic. And one of the things that we see, and I call it almost the perfect storm for rejecting medical science. And one of those is the fact that if you look at every commercial that's on the evening news, programs like 60 Minutes, and et cetera, just about every one of those commercials are for a pharmaceutical. And in every one of them, at least 3 to 4 times, talk to your doctor, talk to your doctor, talk to your doctor. And what this has created is an external locus of control. And that means that people believe that control of their health is outside of them, that they don't have the ability to make decisions about their health internally. And so it's this loss of control that is driving, to a certain extent, this concept that we're going to turn to these outsiders. and we're not real good at determining who's a good outsider or not. And the last piece of it is this expert intervention. And what we know is that trusted experts or celebrities can improve acceptance. But the opposite is also true. And so what's happened is that we've got a number of people that have name recognition and have massive social media accounts. And whatever their words are, people hang on them. So one of the things that is going to be important for us moving forward is to find these trusted experts or celebrities and work with them to improve acceptance. Now, we talked about this perfect storm, and I got just a couple minutes here, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, but we talk about this perfect storm. So we take in a reduction in health literacy. We have an external locus of control, and then we have this massive explosion of social media. So with all those facing us, we ask the question, when is it not worth it? When is it not worth us beating our heads against the wall to explain to somebody? Well, roughly 58% of the population will understand the information and make an informed decision. Roughly 35% of the population will be willing to listen to evidence-based logic, although they might not be ready to decide today. And we've run into those people quite frequently in our professions. But here's the one. Roughly 7% of the population will never change their minds regardless of the logic, evidence, time, or any other opportunity that's provided for them to do so. Talking to one of my students who's a physician, and she says, you know, Bruce, there's some people that they tell me their situation, and I say, okay, and I basically walk away. And one of my colleagues said to me, well, you know, aren't you going to try to convince them otherwise? And she said, why? Why would I waste my time? They've made their decision, and it's based on certain factors. And she said, I know enough that these factors are not going to change. So what's going to be real important to us moving forward is if we can identify these roughly 35% of the population who will be willing to listen, and that we can help them move to a positive decision. And that is a lot of what we hope happens, especially using AI. And with that segue, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Sri. Go get him.
Bruce, thank you. Thank you for such a detailed, articulated explanation of all of those really important aspects that you know we need to consider. It's really important. Dr. Reagan and I have been discussing about this in preparation, and we actually discussed about many of the components that you're bringing up actually in the chat, and I'll be we'll be revisiting some of those at the end hopefully, but I just wanted to bring up some of the very good points about flat earther and some of the other conspiracy theories that are out there, and just why that some of these rational explanations, even though they are in existence, why people refuse to acknowledge them. And so I'm core faculty in the College of Health Sciences, and so my perspective here is a little bit more from a statistics analytic perspective as to, we're seeing all of this social media out there, and all of these tweets going back and forth, and all of these posts and all of this. How do we make sense of it? We go back to the original model of data, right? Leads to information, leads to knowledge, eventually, which leads to wisdom. So how do we understand messy data sets, right? And how do we make sense of it? So when you open up a traditional data set, say in SPSS, you see numbers, you see categories, you see variables, you see the data view, you see variable view, and that's what you're traditionally trained to recognize as a data set. But when we're talking about social media, how do you treat that as a data set? But I'm going to make the argument today that this is in fact a data set. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So vaccine hesitancy, of course, just talking about the infodemic and how there was a flux of information, how Bruce explained all of this, how there was kind of information that seemed to multiply exponentially. So one, I think, very important principle to recognize early on when we're thinking about social media is the fact that social media is like a static global monolith, and it behaves almost like an independent system, generating its own sort of knowledge base and reinforcing itself in one way or another. And so if you understand this as a system, if you understand it as behaving as a system, so then you will understand that it has its own data set, and then you can understand how you can better make sense of the data. So that's the premise behind how I'm going to be presenting the information. For those of you that are relatively familiar with qualitative research, thematic analysis is one way to sort of, quickly but systematically make sense of a lot of sort of narrative information, right? But I'm going to show a more systematic method using artificial intelligence. So, of course, we also know the fact that, in YouTube in the last 30 days, or if you look, 361 million videos have been uploaded. So there's quite a few videos. So all of this information is just being transmitted throughout the internet. And so how that is behaving, how that's building, that's important to note. Okay, so that's one principle. Now, something else to note, and very important point as we're thinking about vaccine hesitancy, is the fact that minority populations and historically marginalized populations are in many ways, not getting the vaccines and also experiencing vaccine hesitancy. And one challenge has been to understand the reasons and understand, kind of the sentiment. And Twitter is in fact a social media data set and social media network, which according to a 2015 report, in that 28% of African Americans who were internet users use Twitter, whereas 20% of Caucasians who are online users use Twitter. So this shows that if we understand sentiment as it pertains to different ethnic groups, then we can even understand more specifically what are those perceptions and what are the driving factors behind vaccine hesitancy. So if we think about how we can make sense of this a little bit more, let's also think about what is going on simultaneously, kind of at a policy level. So of course, we decided to quantitatively understand and analyze online behavior by understanding what Twitter users have to say. But where that compares to understanding with Healthy People 2030 is the fact that if you understand the sentiment, and if you understand what is kind of the motivating factors, the driving factors, then you can better address the objectives in Healthy People 2030. And what I wanted to also bring to the forefront is that this has been an objective that has been included in Healthy People 2030. So for those of you that may not have looked at the new objectives, I would urge you to take a look. Another highlight is the fact that the number of objectives have been reduced dramatically from over 1,000 to now only 355. So this is a really practical tool, not only to use along with artificial intelligence and sentiment analysis, but also to just use generally for research purposes. So this is, again, understanding now how not only people develop information and misinformation, how that develops within the context of social media, but how people perceive and receive information. So this actually is, ironically, also addressed in Healthy People 2030 in great detail. So there was a special commission that was established around 2018, a special sort of working group that was, they were working on a number of angles as this was built, but the main highlight here, and this really contributes to our discussion about vaccine hesitancy and conspiracy theories, is the fact that organizational health literacy. So it's not only the fact that individuals may have limited health literacy, but are we doing enough, institutionally as a whole, to make sure that our resources are such that people will understand the concept of RNA and of DNA and how some of these vaccines, the RNA technology, protects the individual. Sometimes this concept is not easy to understand. So there may be some pictures and other sorts of tools to help make the material a little bit more easy to follow. Okay, so a little bit more about Healthy People 2030. Although this is a developmental objective, it is important to note that this has been established. Social media has been established as a social marketing tool, and that this is something that is being worked on a national level. So that was a little bit more about understanding how, social media research can be applied and interfaces with artificial intelligence. Now transitioning into understanding about artificial intelligence and just the wide range of possibilities that are that you can accomplish with this. I think one of the most fascinating things about artificial intelligence, that for the longest time we were seeing this in sci-fi movies, right? You were seeing all of these gradual development of machines somehow, gaining intelligence and enough intelligence to the point that eventually, they become the superior species. So in science fiction, there were a lot of these imagined possibilities already described in detail. But we have entered an era when these fictional possibilities are now a reality. And you at home actually can take part in using some of these really important but easy to follow tools in your research, in your practice, in your smart homes, and just integrate this once you start understanding some of the basics. So my aim today is to arm you with some basic tools so that you can get started with some artificial intelligence activities. So And of course, we're going to be talking about vaccine hesitancy the whole time as the example to kind of illustrate how artificial intelligence can be applied. So while artificial intelligence I'm using broadly, today I'll be specifically focusing on something called natural language processing. Another area that is very popular is machine learning. There's unsupervised machine learning, there's supervised machine learning. I have several models that I have presented at national statistical conferences, which are novel prediction models of diabetes and some other conditions. So that I will not be talking about today, but I will be giving you enough starter resource information tools that if interested, you would be able to get started on some of those on your own. Okay, so the first resource that I want to share with all of you is something called GitHub, GITHUB. So this is a really important resource where collaborators from all over the world have openly shared very detailed step-by-step process of how they have completed their artificial intelligence projects. And so, everybody, whoever kind of joins the community, they start sharing their code, and people from all over start collaborating. I've contacted authors, and so this is a really good starting place. Another important software that you want to know about is Python, like the snake, but it's the name of a software, and it's an open source. It's all free to use and easily available. Okay, so what is artificial intelligence all about? Again, the possibilities really, when I say are endless, they are endless. From recognition, from vision recognition. You might have seen a documentary on 60 Minutes on deep fakes, which is also part of artificial intelligence, where people's faces can be completely recreated and on a video shown to say things that the actual person never actually said. And so some of these things can be used, in simulations when we're talking about public health sort of issues and understanding some of these things. A lot of times in collaboration, this may help. So there's so many different angles. This goes into a little bit more about the complexity of artificial intelligence. I included this diagram to show how complex this can be. So as you can see, there's not a lot of this processing and the speech recognition. There's a lot of different possibilities, but under natural language processing even, there's a lot of different categories like text generation, question answering, context extraction, classification, and then machine translation. In addition, there's really, there's actually a lot of other different tasks that NLP is capable of. So when we talk about speech recognition, if you're given a sound clip of a person or people speaking, then you can easily determine the textual representation of the speech. So the machine is able to do that. So these are different parts of text and speech processing. So that's one task. And then morphological analysis. So how does the word get broken down in morphology? So this might be morphemes, so small segments. And of course, depending on language, this changes. So this can become, morphological analysis becomes pretty complex. And then there's syntactic analysis. And then, this can become really complex. But these are some examples. Relational semantics. A lot of this goes into linguistics. But to get started, you don't really necessarily need to know all of the different details of natural language processing. But just to appreciate all of the complex aspects. So here is a diagram which has been created with artificial intelligence and public health surveillance in mind. So I wanted to show through this image the fact that public health is using artificial intelligence, and we're already starting to apply this technology. Where is it being used? Well, there's 3 different broad categories that artificial intelligence is being used. So when we're thinking about extending data sources, of course, we're talking about social media today, if you look under cyber world, but you can, in the same way, analyze blogs, form information in the same way. So even in the physical world, the environment, data analytics, as of course we know, outbreak detection, early warning, spatial temporal analytics. So in even geospatial settings, a lot of times when there is not enough information about a certain remote sensed area. So images that have been gleaned from satellites, some of the imagery is not very clear. So using AI guided confirmation and imagery, this can become a lot more clear. So this is actually actively being used and incorporated. Google is using AI very actively, but almost all the major companies, in fact. But then finally, of course, epidemic modeling and simulation. So in a lot of simulation studies, and of course, when we were trying to predict, the track of COVID and the direction that it's headed in, some of that information can be AI guided. So now to just talking about, again, integrating some of this from the perspective of Healthy People 2030. So I'm using Healthy People 2030 to illustrate how AI can interface with public health. This is the case that I'm making here, that we can really use Healthy People 2030 as that interface. So when we're thinking about what is the tool that we can use, I introduced to you 2 resources at the beginning. So I said, GitHub is one resource, right? And then Python. So when you're thinking about Python, before thinking about Python, as you can see, there's a lot of coding and syntax involved. So before jumping right into Python, I think it's also important to think about some of the other sorts of web-based programs that there may be available, where you don't have to do any programming, but you can kind of get similar information. So SentiStrength is a third resource that I will give to you, that I really want each and every one of you to just take a look, and it's really quick. You just include some sort of, maybe a tweet that you saw, or you can create your own sentence and see how it operates, and it will generate a sentiment analysis. It's open source, doesn't require any sort of account information, but it's actually been in existence for roughly about 12 years now. So this technology has been really developed. It's AI as well. It's AI driven. It uses NLP as well, natural language processing, but you don't have to do any of the coding in that method. So, why did I not use that system? And why did I go the Python route? You may be asking. So the reason being is that there are several drawbacks and disadvantages there. In the system that I was able to use in Python, I actually used something called an API. So this was an interface that I had to apply to become a Twitter developer. And so this was a application process. And, if you want to do any sort of research with Twitter, I encourage you to apply for this. And so so in this system, the reason this is advantageous is because you can take a year's worth of tweets simultaneously and directly from websites, and you can do something called scraping. So Twitter scraping is what you technically call when you're taking information for a whole year or longer. So that sort of magnitude of data cannot be transferred from something called CentiStrength or another program. You would need to use Python. So now, if kind of moving on to Python, so this is the code that I wrote, and this incorporates. I actually went in and replaced my personal code with X's on the fourth line. You'll notice, because I didn't, obviously, if you that's unique to me, and if I'm not allowed to share that. But other than that, everything. So this code would not work on your machine if you were to use this exact syntax. Don't get worried, if it doesn't work, because it's not supposed to. So just going through some of these findings, this is how a traditional Python code would look like. So the first 3 lines, this is just importing some of the packages that you will be using within the program that you have written. So tweepy, and you're importing it as TW. And so I don't run Python, by the way, independently. I use it through something called Anaconda. Anaconda is the broader interface. And for parsing, so parsing is another terminology that is used in programming to check the code. So for parsing purposes, I use something called Spyder, Spyder. So and there's again, if you go through the website and if you go through GitHub, you can see tutorials. But sentiment analysis has multiple steps, and these are just in summary the steps. The steps that you take in one slide. So if you want to kind of sum up everything in sentiment analysis that is really important to consider in Python, this is a good slide to look at before you start any sort of programming. So here's the output. Here's the artificial intelligence output. Once I had, and this program was about 4 pages long, but at the end, the output was really interesting. So at the bottom, the x-axis is the polarity. And this is between -1 and 1. 1 is more positive polarity and positive sentiment, and -1 is more negative sentiment. So as you can see, when we were looking at vaccinations from November 1, there was a lot of positive kind of hope and everything, and but then seemed like as when we restricted it to a little bit more recent, then the polarity actually was more extreme. So as you can see, the sentiment was more all across the board. So from 1 to -1, it was So a society more polarized. That's what this reflects. And I think it's really fascinating the fact that we can harness the power of artificial intelligence to understand the sentiment of society. And again, making the case for the fact that social media is almost operating like a monolithic cultural contribution. And so almost like a static contribution. So symbols are spread globally through social media, which are not necessarily, local cultural, but monolithic. And so opinion, conspiracy theories, sentiments, these are as social media becomes more popular, these become more standardized globally and gain a lot more traction. And that is what this is reflecting. So, just a couple more minutes here. I want to highlight some of the important findings here and really demonstrate the power of AI. So as you can see on the left, you have common words found in tweets. Now, what I had to do is gradually kind of exclude certain words. And these were the most common words that were found. So, ideally, we would want to exclude vaccine and more developed, sophisticated searches. But you learn to do that as you're doing these searches. So it's kind of an iterative process. But it seems like, some of the ideas that people were thinking about is, of course, need was an interesting word that was there on the left, but just people and it was Delta was on people's minds, right? So Delta made it up there. So you can kind of tell, and this can be much more refined. These searches and common word finds. But you get a general sense of what people are frustrated with, or what people are thinking about, or just what people are talking about, in general. So all of these visuals were actually created in Python, and the visuals are quite stunning that you can create in through syntax. So, again, when I first started, I told you I was going to share with you practical tools. And I hope, that some of these tools will help you get started in starting to ask some of these questions about society, about social media, and how it influences information, how it influences and guides people's opinions, and helps direct misinformation in a uniform way. And that is very important, in a uniform way in which people's thoughts and ideas are more similar than different. And so then sometimes, some of these ideas, some of the fringe ideas gain more traction than if there were no social media. So artificial intelligence really can help understand that and guide our research and also policy. And then also potential communication strategies that we can also harness social media to communicate important health information and preventative messages and vaccine information. So these are the main sorts of ideas and applications and steps that are behind artificial intelligence. I hope this has really, piqued some interest in this. I hope some of you will start asking in this area and exploring further. So at this point, thanks for listening. And at this point, we can take some questions and maybe go through the chat box maybe and see what's there.
Sure thing, Dr. Banerjee. The first, let's start. Does Python code a lot for word context using preceding and succeeding words to delineate context? For example, convolutional neural networks, bidirectional long, short-term memory, and embedding.
So, yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so going back to some Python code, so neural networks are a little bit outside of natural language processing. That is not really an area that we were focusing on in this. So those areas might be other processes that might inform natural language processing and our endeavors here. So there is definitely some overlaps. So that is definitely a good point there between different types of artificial intelligence. But neural networks are more machine learning.
Okay. Thank you. Comment, it was noted that people reporting the greatest likelihood of passing on disinformation were people who thought the information was true and or who had pre-existing attitudes consistent with it. The introduction of I'm assuming that meant flat earth movement started the anti-science movement in the mid-1800s by providing what seemed reasonable analysis but failed to account for more complicated natural science phenomena. So how do you interrupt that cycle and the preceding circular argument that is often used to substantiate these views? That's a great question, and one that I think we could probably take an entire webinar to discuss, looking at misinformation and how to counteract and counter-prevent that.
Jennifer, if I could just take 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
If there's two things that we've discovered over the course of time, it's first and foremost that we're not countering these bad messages. The number of bad messages being out there overwhelms the number of good messages. And the second thing is we got to make it understandable and believable and throw the emotion as part of it instead of just being these scientific mouths. We've got to be more common information with an emotional tinge to it. And those two things seem to be critical across the board.
Thank you, Dr. Reagan. A couple of other comments before we wrap up. A large number of vaccine hesitants are Republicans and have voted for Donald Trump in either one or both elections. You talk about trusted celebrities improving acceptance. What do you think about those demographics refusing to accept that Donald Trump did get the vaccine and that they continue to deny COVID vaccines' sheer existence? Another great question.
Well, I think I responded back to that individual with the comment that the uniqueness of Donald Trump, he's a celebrity to start with, and then he moves into the office of president, and that gives him an enormous credibility. And it's the shame is that he wasn't pro-vaccination, because had he been pro-vaccination, what a difference that would have made.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. I think all of the other questions were addressed in the chat box. I do want to bring to your attention, for those of you who are requesting continuing education units, I have posted the link in the discussion box. It will also populate at the end of this webinar. So if you have questions related to that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. Also, you can stay connected with the Walden community on our Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. Going back to Dr. Reagan's previous slide. And with that, we will conclude this webinar. You all will receive a link to the on-demand recording. Please feel free to share that with your colleagues or view at a later time. Again, all of our webinar offerings are free of charge, as well as the continuing education hours associated with it. And with that, I would just like to thank you all again for participating and joining us this afternoon.